If someone handed you 39 books written by more than 30 different people across roughly 1,000 years, kings, shepherds, prophets, exiles, people writing from palaces, people writing from prisons, you would expect a complete mess. People who didn't know each other. And instead, what you get is the Old Testament. One story, one God, one promise made early and kept slowly across thousands of years of human history. And because of that, I want to step back through this and look at the general shape of it. Because once you see the shape of it, each of the individual stories and how they sit inside of this shape will appear to you much more clearly. We are about, in the Bible in Small Steps, to start the Old Testament. That's going to be a big challenge. So if it took a year and a half to cover the New Testament, it is probably going to take about 7 years to cover the Old Testament. It is a very large book, but you might ask, what's important about it? Why does it matter with the Old Testament? And I do think that the New Testament is important for us to understand as Christians, or if you're not a Christian and you're wondering, what is it that Christians believe or what is it they see? It's important to understand the New Testament, of course. But the Old Testament is suddenly the whole backstory. You see the shape of everything in it. And that's why we're going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about it story by story so that you understand everything that's going on. So let's just start with the numbers because they're bigger than most people expect. 39 books, more than 30 authors, shepherds like Amos, kings like David and Solomon, cupbearers like Nehemiah, priests, prophets, and several books where we just don't simply know who held the pen. Judges, Ruth, Kings, Esther are all anonymous. And it's not a weakness by any means because you understand that God is the entire thread that goes through all of this. That we trust the word because it is God's thread throughout our world that's here. And as the span of time, it's harder even in our hold in our heads. It's roughly 1,000 years. Started with Moses writing the first 5 books somewhere around 1400 BC, all the way to Malachi, who's the last prophet, around 430 BC. So Jesus born a few years before, BC, like 4 BC. So there was 200 or 425 years-ish of silence before we had one chapter to the other. But there are other silences in there. 1,000 years of authors who, for the most part, never knew each other, never compared notes, and still wrote one unified story. So how it breaks down in the Old Testament isn't just a pile of 39 separate books. It moves in 4 distinct movements, and each one is doing a different kind of messaging that's here. First, we have the law, and that's going to be what's called the Torah, the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. It's the foundation of everything else stands on. It answers the biggest questions. Who is God? Who are we? What went wrong in our relationship? And how is it that God chose one family, Abraham's, to carry his promise forward to all people on earth? And by the time you get to the end of Deuteronomy, God rescues his people out of Egypt, gives him the law at Sinai, and they're standing on the edge of a promised land. And nothing that comes after it makes any sense without this particular section, because then you'll understand what happens, why it matters after what happens based on these first 5 books. So then comes the history, and these are 12 books. It's Joshua through Esther. And this is the covenant getting lived out in real time. Then comes the history. These are 12 books, Joshua through Esther, that the covenant is getting lived out in real time. It's not a clean success story. You get conquests, judges failing repeatedly, and then you get a monarchy, shaky under Saul, starting out strong under David, and then slowly starts to disintegrate, falling apart, divided kingdoms, and eventually exiles. The people God rescued earlier on now get carried off by various empires. They're supposed to be the light into the world, and now they're being enslaved by these other empires. Remarkably, you get a return. Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilds what was lost. History in the Old Testament is not a straight up line. It's a long account of a covenant people who keep failing and a God who always stays faithful to them anyway. you think about it, I don't know, like I said, my dad was an atheist, and I grew up as an atheist, was saying like, "Oh, this is a propaganda piece," of just saying how great, this nation is and how great these people are, and then you read it and you're like, "Yeah, I don't think you read it because that is not it at all." Real people with real ups and downs as a people, and not just as persons, but real persons with ups and downs also. Then we get into wisdom and poetry books, and these are 5 books, Job through Song of Songs. And this section steps out of a timeline and written by many different people, many different authors at many different times. Job wrestles with suffering that doesn't make any sense. Psalm gives you an entire vocabulary for praising, praying, lament, confession, gratitude, and maybe sometimes even anger. Proverb hands some practical wisdoms of daily life, and Ecclesiastes is a brutally honest about emptiness and chasing after meaning in the wrong places. Then comes Song of Songs, which celebrates love, marriage, and then gives us an analogy to Israel's relationship with God. A lot of times when we see the marriage imagery that is either in the New Testament or Old Testament, it's giving us an imagery of our relationship to God and how we treat God and how God treats us back in return. This section is really where the Old Testament stops narrating and starts speaking to us directly. Then we get the prophets, and we'll talk about that there are 17 books, Isaiah through Malachi. So 5 what they call major prophets and 12 minor prophets. Major and minor just refers to the length, not the importance. Keep that in mind. There was someone joke like, there was like a meme and saying, you telling your mom that you never quite made it to being a major prophet. It just talked about how big the books are. But these are God's covenant lawyers. They're sent again and again to call his people back to where they have drifted, warn them honestly about judgment, and every single time leaves the door open with the promise of restoration and a coming Messiah. The prophets are where the Old Testament starts pointing forwards at something and someone who is still coming to them. So the whole through line about these different segments that we talked about is about promise, faithfulness. God makes promises in Genesis. He makes promises to Abraham. He blesses the world through his family. And every single book that is after that, in its own way, is building towards that promise, testing it, waiting on it, wondering what's going to happen next. The law establishes a relationship. The history shows us how badly humans have kept it, and we can see it in our own times too, right? And how patiently God keeps showing up anyway. The wisdom books try to teach us actual lessons of life and relationships on a day-to-day basis. And then the prophets keep the promise alive of everything that is happening right at that time and that what is going to come yet. And it says it over and over again with each of the prophets. Underneath this is the same kind of principle we keep coming back to time and time again in the show. We cannot keep our end of any promise perfectly. God keeps his anyway. That's not a New Testament idea grafted backwards onto the Old Testament. It's the entire architecture of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Thousands of years before Christ ever arrived in his earthly form that he did in Matthew, it is finishing what the Old Testament kept pointing towards. Hey, this is coming. Keep your eyes open. And that's Christ coming at that point. So what does this mean for our own walks here? It matters because this ancient book matters. It matters not just in our Bible study. It matters what happens to us on a Tuesday. It happens happens to us in the grocery store or on our way to work. Most of us live lives of faith in the same way we read the Old Testament with no sense of its shape. We sort of live one isolated story at a time, no context, wandering through each of our own histories one day at a time. But we may be wondering why our own history feels, like the Judges. We'll talk about the on-ramp of the Judges, constant circle, that our own lives never feel like a straight line to victory. It feels like we have successes and we fail. We have successes and we fail. That is the shape of the Old Testament, and something that hopefully helps you to understand that God was never expecting a straight line. He wrote 1,000 years or thousands of years of failure, but then faithfulness into his own scripture on purpose. Your slow, uneven walk with God isn't a departure from the pattern. It is the pattern. It is the pattern of mankind. And so if you're in a lost season and you're be given a foundation. If you're at a history season, you're living in a mess, honestly. And instead of pretending that it isn't, you need to see what it is, that you are in a mess. And if you're living in a wisdom season, you're being taught how to pray, how to live. And if you're in a prophet season, it's about waiting, longing, wondering, is the promises of God still coming to us? And that's the most biblical place to be, wherever it is you're at right now, that's what we're going to take on. And we're going to look at it one story at a time, one person at a time. Once you read the Old Testament and the stories, sometimes they feel small or disconnected. You remember that you're not standing alone. I remember my friend was talking about how she finds the Old Testament very, very difficult. Because these are people that don't live in a culture like mine. I don't understand them. I don't understand the people in the story. And to me, and I tried to explain my point of view of it, they're just people. They have businesses, they have families, they worry about their kids, they worry about their spouse. They wonder if they're doing the right thing. They try to do the right thing and they don't do the right thing. It's people. All this is just people. And so even though that one thread, thousands of years of tapestry built into it, it's 30 different hands all pointing to the same unbroken promises that we're getting today. We're still part of that tapestry as well. So don't see it, I guess, as being disconnected from your life. Look at it as something that it is everything that is leading up to your life and including your life. I hope that this will help you understand the New Testament. Like I said, we are going to, in September, start Genesis, and we're going to do it instead of chapter by chapter. We're going to do it story by story. So we're going to try to keep the stories more together so they don't get so discombobulated. We'll talk about a particular aspect of the Bible, and then we'll talk about the areas surrounding it. So we could talk about Adam and Eve. Well, what was Eden? What was Eden like? Is Eden really the first temple? What was the expected life like to be on Eden, to live in this particular piece? Or in Exodus? Sure, we got the Exodus, but what does it mean that they ended up building a tabernacle and carrying it across the desert? What does that mean for us? So we will do stories together as a cohesive piece so that you can understand everything about it. Appreciate you being out there. You can find every way to contact me and everything I do at jillfromthenorthwoods.com. Thanks so much. Can't wait to see you there.